Alright, so this is your second Revit tutorial. This one's going to be strictly over walls and some of the different properties and stuff that go into them. So if we go up here and click on the Walls tab, I'm going to start with just a generic wall, and there are these kind of pre-built ones, but I'm going to show you kind of what goes into making some of these, and then we'll get into some of the modeling and stuff like that. Okay, so we've got our properties window down here. We've got our 8-inch generic wall, which basically just means it's 8 inches thick. It's an unspecified material. There's no layers to it or anything like that. It's unconnected, so it's not constrained to a top level. We're drawing it on level 1, but it goes up an unconnected 20 feet. So if we wanted to make this so that it was constrained to level 2, we can click that, and now it shows, it grays out the unconnected height because it's now constrained to a level, and you can't just punch in something when it's constrained to a level. So it's 10 feet high, and then as you go down, there's some more properties down here, but none of this is sort of modeling based. So if I just draw a wall here, and as I zoom in here, I'm going to change my detail level to fine. That way we'll be able to see kind of what's going on as we model this thing. So if I click on my wall and hit Edit Type, it brings up my secondary type properties menu. Expand this out so we can see what's going on here. Okay, so under Structure, if we click this Edit tab, this pulls up the assembly window. Kind of a menu buried within a window here, and right now it just shows structure. It doesn't have a material, so as you can see it's just by category, so we can apply a material to that. And then thickness, so we're 8 inches thick, and then this is checked and shows that it's a structural material. The only benefit to the structural material is if you're working with a structural engineer or something like that, you can designate what's structural and what's not, and do takeoffs and things like that, and sort things out by just structure. So you could, filter everything out that's non-structural, and just see what in your model is doing the work for you. So let's say we wanted to make a typical interior 2x4 stud wall. So, and we'll say it's structural for now, and we're going to say, okay, 2x4 stud is 3.5 inches thick, and if we change this, we'll apply a material to it, and all the way down here, let's see, should be wood stud, maybe not. Let's see, that may be something that I put into my own template. Okay, so we'll just create our own material here. So I'm going to name this. And when you're creating a new material, always put a dash in front of it. And the reason for that is any material that you've created, if you put a dash in front of it, it'll jump it to the top of the list, rather than it filtering into all this, because as you go through a model you might create a lot of materials, and it just gets to be chaotic to try to sort through all this and find what you're looking for. So then over here, real quick, under the cut pattern, I'm going to change this to solid fill, and it's going to solid fill this color. So basically what I did was I applied a wood stud layer, and then within that wood stud layer, I said any time that this is cut by my view, I wanted to sort of post-shade that layer sort of a dark gray here. So that's all I did there. And if I hit OK and OK, now you can see how this is a dark fill. So I can draw my floor plans and stuff, and anywhere there's a wood stud layer applied, it's going to post-shade that for me. But we're not done making our wood stud layer or our standard interior wall just yet. So I'm going to say insert, and I'm going to insert a layer. And I always try to keep my core boundary around my studs. That's sort of a standard, just because when you're dimensioning floor plans, try to always dimension them to the face of your stud rather than to the face of your finish. The reason for that is the guys who are framing it are going to come in first. They're going to frame it, and you don't want them having to try to do math and subtract the 1/2 inch drywall or the 5 inch drywall or whatever your finish is off of every dimension in your entire model to figure out what they need to frame stuff at. Once it's framed, the drywallers and stuff, they'll come in and just cover the wall, so they don't really need to know what the dimensions of the room are other than to do material takeoffs and things like that. So try to keep your core boundaries sort of around your stud layers. So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to say, okay, rather than it being a structural layer, it's going to be a finish layer, and this is going to be a gypboard or drywall. So this one should be gypsum wallboard, and I'll hit OK, and that's going to be 1/2 inch thick. And this little checkbox here, wraps, that just means that when you do a joint, it wraps the end. So if I create my other one, and I'll show you guys how that works. So I'm going to change this to finish layer, change that to gypboard, and change this to 1/2 inch. I hit OK, OK. And now if we look close, we've got these two layers that it shows on either side of the poché dark layer. So it's showing us the two gypboard layers and then our stud layer all built within this wall. And now if I create a wall, every time I draw that, it's going to show me all three of those layers. So when I do a connection, what I meant by wraps is if I click on this, you can see that it's taking this wall and this wall is continuing on. It's not mitering the corner. I mean, when you frame stuff out, very, very rarely do you actually miter your corners. So this is going to butt into this, and what that wraps means is that these finishes, so the gypboard, is going to wrap the end here. So it's going to fill this end cap with the gypboard as opposed to just leaving it open for the stud. So that's something that as you create more and more layers, you can specify which ones wrap and which ones don't. So maybe on the ends, if you had, your substrate, your airspace, and then your stone or something like that, and for whatever reason when you returned you didn't want the air gap, you just wanted the stone, you could click the air gap wrapping off and it would just take the stone there. So in terms of creating walls, that's pretty easy. So if I go back in here and say, okay, rather than this just being a 3.5 inch wood stud, we're going to say, okay, we've got our gypboard on the inside. So as you can see, this is the interior side, this is the exterior side in terms of as you're building. So we're going to delete that finish layer, and we're going to insert another layer here, and we'll say we're going to use 7/16, and we're going to create a substrate here. So we'll say where are you? There it is, plywood sheeting. So we'll hit OK there, and this is our structural material, but see how it'll only allow one structural material per wall assembly here. So structure, this is our substrate, and then we'll insert a 1/2 inch. We'll say that's a thermal air layer, and that's going to be our rigid insulation, and it already has an applied crosshatch to that. So, but we don't want that to be right now. What this is telling me is the cut pattern, this kind of crosshatch, the lines are going to show up in black. I want that to fade a little bit. I don't want that to be quite so bold. So I'm going to say, okay, make that crosshatch gray. It just takes that hatch back a little bit so it's not quite so in your face. And then we'll insert, and we'll say it's a 4.5 inch, and we'll make a stone texture here. And we'll say stone. And then I'm going to apply a surface pattern. I'm going to create a new one. And I'll import a file. I'll say Copperfield. And then we'll say 1. Okay. And we'll get into this kind of stuff a little bit more as we get into the material editor and all of that stuff. But for now, don't worry too much about what I'm doing here. I'm just creating this wall. So right now I've shown that my stone is wrapping, my rigid insulation is wrapping. So that gives me kind of a built-up assembly of a stone wall. So if I hit OK, let's see, cannot ascend from core boundary to fit. Oh, okay. So this is structural, so I want this to be finished. So if I hit OK. Now, down here, I can show a few different things. Wrapping at inserts, so this is windows, doors, that sort of thing. What was it doing there? Do you want the finish to wrap into those inserts? And which finish? So exterior, interior, or both. Usually, you probably want your interior finish for sure to wrap, depending on the look you're going for and everything. Your exterior finish could wrap as well, depending on where you're placing your windows and doors and things like that. That can be, something that you decide on. I'll hit both for now. And then wrapping at the ends, we talked about which one wraps. We'll say our interior finish wraps at the ends. So we say OK, and now it's built up this larger thickness here. So I've got my gyp, my stud layer, I've got my substrate, my thermal layer, which is that smaller one just off of my substrate, and then I've got my 4.5 inch stone. So if I go to my 3D view here, now you can see my stone hatch on here is pretty big. Because it was a drafting pattern, this will scale as I increase my scale here. So if I hit that to 1 inch, now it starts to read a little bit better. So you can play with that as you go through and see how you want stuff to read and that sort of thing. So we built up this stone wall, and similarly you can build up pretty much any type of wall. That's the same way that all these other walls here are built up. So your brick, your exterior CMU on metal stud, all of that stuff is built the same way as we just built our wall. Some of the other things that you can do with walls, let's go back into our editor here. If we go hit this preview tab, it pulls it out so you can see what things are doing here. But you can change this. So this is showing me a plan view, but you can flip it to a section view. And then down here are a bunch of options that you can start to change and add various things. So I can zoom in here, and let's say we split a region. So now I've split this region 2'8" up. So I can then apply, so modify, and you can merge it. If you, for whatever reason, you don't want that to happen, you can merge those back. But if I want to insert a new layer here, I'll say a finish, and we're going to make this, we'll make this a brick layer. And I want to assign layers to that. So if once I've hit that, see how it shows the 4.5? It's now showing stone above brick. So you can layer stuff on top of one another. Something else you can do you can add a sweep. So let's add a sweep here. The profile, we'll say it's a parapet cap. Doesn't really matter what we want to do. So it creates this sweep here, and within this I can say, okay, I want that to go from the top, I want it on the exterior side, I can offset it, say 6 inches if I want, set back 3 inches, and if I hit apply, okay, it's going to be at the top. So it starts to create this sweep, and everywhere I draw this wall, this is going to be attached to it. Obviously that's not positioned quite right. I can apply a different material to that as well. I can say whether it's cuttable or not. So if I were to put this at, say, 3 feet, and then I put a door in this wall, it would cut that. So I can flip it, and it'll flip it vertically, flip it back. So you can select all sorts of different profiles. We'll get into making your own profile and stuff like that. But now that you create that, you can also create reveals. So the same thing as a sweep, only a notch cut out of the wall. So let's say we put a reveal in here. Let's add one. We'll say 1 brick. Okay. And let's offset that. Let's say 2 feet. And jump that up there. And let's offset that back, say 3 inches. Okay. So now that we have all of this kind of built in here, if I hit OK, now you see the cutout. So that's our reveal that we placed. You see the brick below the stone, and then you see the parapet cap up here. Personally, I don't like to work my walls this way in terms of doing reveals, and the reveals can sometimes be nice if it's continuous around your entire building. Most of the time you don't have a situation where your site is perfectly level, nothing's stepping up and down and everything. You don't have to worry about how things align, and all of that stuff starts to kind of wreak havoc on things like this. It's not real often that these line up everywhere. You usually have different eave heights, things like that. And it's not very often that you end up with a wall stacked on top of another wall where the thickness doesn't change. That is one limitation where you really can't set a different thickness to the bottom as you do the top. And that's often the case. A lot of times you'll have, say, a stone on the bottom and then like a Revit or a stucco on the top, and the stucco isn't near as thick as the stone on the bottom, so you have kind of a cap, a transition between the two. That would be, to do that, you would need to create 2 separate walls and stack them on top of each other, and then kind of constrain them together. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So if I go back to my standard view here, or my floor plan view, and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to do a 5-inch. Actually, let's start with a 6-inch, so we do the larger one on the bottom. So I'll draw this wall here, and I'm going to say it's unconnected, and I'm going to say it's only going to go up 3 feet. So that'll be a 3-foot, just generic wall. And then if I draw another wall, and it's going to be 5 inches thick, I want to draw from my finished face, and I'm going to align one side here. I'm going to click that, and I want it to go up to 10 foot, but I want my base to be offset 3 feet. So that way it stacks on top of the 2 of those. So now if I go, I've got my 2 walls, and one is stacked on top of the other one here. So if I were to line the 2 of those, they're already aligned, okay? So, but when I hit align, to the 2, it brings up this little lock. So if I hit lock that, it's going to lock that alignment. So if I ever move this, it moves the other one. Now, it's not going to stay in line horizontally, but it stays in line this way. So, as I move this thing back and forth, I can shift one wall off from the other, but it's always going to keep that alignment. If I wanted to lock the other way, I can always align this to that and lock that into place. So now no matter where I move it, it's going to hold that one side. But obviously now it's stretching this. It's holding that one and it's holding this one, but it's not holding that other end. So you can start to lock things into place and keep things where you want them. And that's, I've found, is kind of a better way to go about it. Gives you a little bit more flexibility than something like this where you're kind of stuck with the profiles and stuff that you've created within that wall type. It just keeps you from having 80 different wall types when you do it this way, because if this is always the same and that's always the same, now I can play with the heights of those and everything from wall to wall, as opposed to I'm stuck with the 3-foot height here, the 7-foot height here, and where the cap and the reveal and all that stuff is. So that's the way I prefer to work it. If you like the way this works and that works better for you, you at least know how to do it. So, and when you get out into the field and stuff, sometimes people like to work this way, and you'll at least have some familiarity with it. Okay, so other than that, in terms of walls, there's not too much more to it. Obviously, you have your different stuff up here. Some of the stuff within here is fairly, well, it's not stuff that you're probably going to use all the time, so I wouldn't worry too much about that stuff right now. Whenever you're creating a new wall type, I didn't here, but hit duplicate. That way, because whatever I do to the 5-inch wall type, it's going to change my 5-inch walls everywhere. So if I'm creating a new wall here, come in here and name it something, so then when you change stuff, it only applies to that. So just good practice to do stuff like that. Other than that, that's pretty much all you need to know for walls.